I always begin with this slide in every program I teach. The measure of success is not whether you have a problem, but whether you have the same problem you had last year. And if that resonates with you, I hope that resonates with you. I work with people in all sorts of functions. I work with people in business. I work with not-for-profits. I work for people starting new jobs. And so don't think of it just in terms of last year being a calendar year. It could be a business cycle. It could be some other process. It could be last month. And if you are still addressing and dealing with problems that you had last year, last month, 6 months ago, last school year, this school year, I believe some of what we talk about today can help you. And by the way, you have a pretty good handout with you today, and everything we're also looking at on slides, I'll be glad to provide you the slides. So I really encourage you to your participation, your active participation. Today's learning, here's my confession. About 1% of it is training. About 99% of it is what you already know. It's reminders, but I think they're solid reminders. These are practices today that you will learn that I believe that if you revisit them, if you reapproach them, reapply them, you'll see significant results. But I do want to say, here's what often gets in the way. People think they're so simple and they're so easy that they should be more complicated, and they're not. And people also think, and I know this is hard to believe, that they're beneath them. They're beneath us to do them. So I will say, accept it as not new, accept it as simple and easy, accept it as not beneath you, and doesn't have to be complicated. Can we agree on that? Many of you know my wife, Mary Green, and I learned from Mary the value of hospitality, the value of welcoming people, the value of including people. She also told me it was her hook as a DRE, that if you really want to get people to volunteer and show up as catechists and all the ways that Mary recruited, you just had to invite. And I also learned nobody could turn her down. So we're going to build on some of the material that was launched last fall, where Eileen and Father Tom and thank you. And Frank Hardy started the process, the dialogue around talking about a great leadership text and model, and I want to refer to it again, the Leadership Challenge. So I think many of you have this. If you don't, it's a wonderful book. I'm just going to give background, and I'm sure Father Tom and Eileen may have already provided it. This is one of the strongest texts, models, set of data, set of practices, set of commitments there is in the field of leadership across all fields, whether it's businesses, not-for-profits, education, religious work. What I like about this book is it's so different from all other leadership texts. It's about 30 years old now. I've had the chance to work with both Jim Kouzes and Barry Posner professionally. And what they did is they broke the mold. Before their work, their research, their presentations, their teaching came along, leaders were going out and talking and writing and publishing and giving speeches about what they think about leadership. So it was the Bill Gates talking about what Bill Gates thinks about leadership. And, Steve Jobs and, great leaders. But Jim Kouzes and Barry Posner said, does it really matter what Bill Gates thinks about leadership? What really matters is what followers look for in leaders and what followers most regard. So they have spent their entire careers, Jim Kouzes and Barry Posner, researching, interviewing hundreds of thousands of people, interviewing or surveying hundreds of thousands of people, and coming up with the practices and the skills and the areas of focus, not what leaders think is important, but what followers will follow. So we're going to continue some of our work today, some of our discussion, and I hope if you have spent some time with this book, you'll continue spending some time with the book. There are 5 practices, we'll talk about them, but I want to begin with their definition. If you were to spend any time with the book, their definition of leadership is the art of mobilizing others to want to struggle for shared aspirations. I'm going to stop talking and ask, what word, phrase, what ideas in that definition resonate with you, jump out at you, make you curious, or do you want to remark about? Mobilizing, getting people to take action, because we can't do it all ourselves as leaders. There is no formula, there is no linear, step-by-step certainty of getting there. It is a lot of different practices. But Jim Kouzes and Barry Posner will tell you, because there's 5 practices, challenge the process, and inspire a shared vision, enable others to act, model the way, and encourage the heart. They will say that when leaders do this, they produce marvelous results. But we also, to the extent some of you were reacting to struggle, to want to struggle, shared aspirations. And in businesses, people will do a lot to accomplish. But in education, church work, not-for-profit, there are a lot of people who work for a nominal compensation. Healthcare workers, they are in it for the struggle. It's part of what they do. It's part of what they embrace. It's part of what they're okay with. So I love this definition. It's not about the pursuit of gain. It's about the shared desire to want to struggle. We'll work more with this during the day. Anybody at any time can speak up and react and push back and share your remarks throughout this day. I will tell you, I spent my whole career in corporate until about 2.5 years ago, and then in more recent, the last year and a half, I've spent much of my focus working with churches, schools, not-for-profits. That's where my passion is, and it's where I'd rather be, because we can use that language. We can use prayer, we can use grace. We can sing and we can pray, and we can. And I still like working with all types of organizations, or as a woman recently said, a secular organization. But this grounds us. So I appreciate you saying that we have that in common. But I'm going to challenge all of us, including us. Leaders own the responsibility for mobilizing others. Now, I'm going to give you some tools about how to draw out, get the most out of others. But the greatest factor in why employees disengage is not the work, it's not morale, it's not compensation or money, it's the leader. Now, so what does that say? It's kind of a syllogism here. So if the reason employees stay and remain engaged is the leader, that means you have the greatest influence, the greatest responsibility, both for individual as well as organizational results and accomplishments. It means you matter most. When was the last time you were told you matter the most? We're going to spend some time giving you affirmation about why you matter the most, how you matter the most, and how you can get the most from those people you lead. Okay. I do a lot of discussion, and I really try to emphasize leadership practices. And again, one more way that we can talk more faith-related has to do with humility. And I'm talking about humility in its societal way we understand it, but also in the Christian way, as the way Christ modeled it. And I insist I begin every leadership presentation with a few remarks about humility. And by the way, if you want to just follow along, we're now on page 2, where it says it's impossible to be effective as a leader without humility. It's also impossible to live the spiritual life and live the human life without humility. When I talk to non-religious organization, non-faith-based, I still can talk about humility, because we talk about humility, being humble, what it means. We talk about the ego, and we will. But every organization I talk to, whether it's faith-based or business, they always they want to spend a little time talking about humility, because I set them up to understand it is an absolute trait for leadership. Humility is a balance of where we are in relationship with ourselves, with others, with God, the truth, and our ego. I want to just... Humility, and this is a great explanation, and yet it's a difficult explanation. Humility is a dual capacity to, at the very same moment, hold two views of ourselves. That I'm something and I'm nothing. You have it on the slide and you have it in the paper. That I'm accomplished and I'm unfinished. Talented and average. Special and better than no one. Extraordinary and ordinary. Popular and unknown. Deserving of respect, but no more deserving than anyone else. I have knowledge and yet I'm ignorant with more to learn. I'm strong and I'm weak. I'm right and I'm wrong. I'm capable and I'm incapable. And what's the key word in each of those lines? Yeah. Thank you. So when we believe that, when we understand it, when we consent to it, we instantly become better leaders. Humility is at the core of all we both are and are seen to be. I work with a lot of leaders who they and their teams are struggling. And I recommend a really great book. It's called Egonomics. And by the way, this book is in your bibliography. The subtitle is What Makes Ego Our Greatest Asset or Our Most Expensive Liability? It's a New York Times bestseller. And it talks a lot about the ego, letting us know that ego is an important part of us. Now, sometimes we think of egotistic and we think of egocentric, but the ego is a part of us that God has given us, and there is nothing wrong with it in its purest form. It's the regard we hold for ourselves. But when ego gets off center, off balance, and Jim Kouzes and Barry Posner would say this absolutely, we become off balance. We're no longer able to be rational, biased. We're no longer able to be balanced. And that line there, it's not a typo. It says, ego is an asset that leaders need to take their organizations to good. And Jim Collins, an authority on leadership, wrote a book called Good to Great. And these authors wanted to respond to that. Everyone wants to get to good, and everyone wants to get to great. But without humility, leaders do not move organizations to next levels of achievement. So whether it's the schools we lead, the parishes we lead, the teams we lead, our ego is important, but our humility, and our ego may have got us where we are, but it is only humility that will get us where we're going. So it takes some of this self-awareness to recognize about ourselves. So I get leaders who are saying, so Tom, you're saying that humility is a good thing. And I say, yeah. And they're saying, so you're saying there's a payoff, right? Like if I'm humble, I'll get something for it. And I'm saying, no, that's not what I'm saying. There is a payoff. But the payoff for humility is humility. It's nothing more. Because I get leaders who are saying, you're saying if I'm more humble, my employees will regard me higher. You're saying if I'm more humble, I'll have better sales, I'll have better service, I'll have better popularity, and I'm not saying that. But you said there's a payoff, and I say, yeah, there is a payoff, but the payoff is just that, it's humility. And we do take a few minutes to talk about great leaders who are humble. And in a business environment, it never fails that the first figure that comes to mind when I ask them to think about somebody who is humble is whom? It's always Pope Francis. Even in a secular setting, they get it. Who do you think is second in mind? And no, it's not the person in Washington. But it is always Mother Teresa. So these are men and women who are not leading a faith-based organization, but who get it. And then we spent a few minutes talking about Pope Francis. We won't right now because you have an awareness, a background with him. But Pope Francis is not humble in order to get a payoff, to get better buy-in, to be a better political leader. He's humble because of what it means to be humble and the payoff he receives. One of the things, a great book, you wouldn't tell it by the title. It's called Crossing the Desert, Learning to Let Go, See Clearly, and Live Simply. And it has about half of the book is dedicated to humility. And The author, Robert Wicks, and it's in your bibliography, says, the biggest payoff to humility, to being humble, is freedom. Freedom from letting go of all the things that keep us harnessed, keep us fearful, keep us believing we have to be, think a certain way. And we'll spend a little more time talking about humility and how we can make progress toward humility. But to the extent leaders I speak to, this group and others, do want greatness. They want their schools, their parishes, their organizations to be great. Greatness only comes through humility. It's a paradox. But if we can agree to that, we can move on. Yes?
So some of our diocese staff read Lead with Humility.
Yes.
So I just recommend it since that was brought up.
Okay.
It's an excellent resource.
Jason mentioned the book Lead with Humility, and I just want to make sure I know who's that by, because there's so many good books on humility.
I don't remember who the author is, but it's about the 12, let's see, Jeffrey Krames?
Thank you. Yes. Yes. There's some wonderful books on leadership, humility, and these are the driving forces behind leadership now. I mean, I have a lot of great books. A great book by a local author, James Autry, who was former president and CEO of Meredith Corporation, is The Servant Leader: How to Develop a Creative Team, Develop Great Morale, and Improve Bottom Line. And it is about it at the core of it is humility. But we'll move on. Ego is a liability and an asset. We can have both too little and too much, but when we're centered, we make the greatest contribution. And what we're going to focus on a little bit this morning is a couple ways of staying centered. Staying centered. Humility, curiosity, dignity, and uncertainty. That last one may have you wondering what I mean by uncertainty, but we'll get to that. Okay. I'd like you to take a few minutes, and on page 3, there are, on the left-hand column, interior practices of humility, and on the right-hand column, exterior practices. It's a pretty balanced group. What I'd like you to do is read them just with your highlighter in hand, so that's an instruction. Highlight those that, for some reason or another, appeal to you, make sense, or maybe don't make sense. But I'd like everyone in the room to have a few items in the left-hand column highlighted and a few items in the right-hand column highlighted because of those interior and exterior acts of humility. I'll just give you a few minutes. One of the reasons for a really robust workshop is of course, hearing from others, and you're doing that now. The other reason, and I really believe this, there's power in you hearing yourself say words that you otherwise wouldn't say. So even if you're just restating or reading from this list of interior and exterior acts of humility, there's power in you saying it because you're internalizing it, and your brain is processing it. So I really encourage you. Thank you for that discussion. And we're going to go a step further. And if you turn to the top of page 4, this is a little bit more reflective. I'm not going to ask you to cover all these questions, but who in your life models humility? What do they do? What thoughts or feelings do you associate with humility? In what significant ways have you encountered humility? What interior acts of humility do you practice? What exterior acts of humility do you value? What practices help you incorporate it into your leadership? And what gets in the way of living and leading humbly? Humility is not a recipe for getting somewhere, that if I'm humble, then this happens. All sorts of things can be the outcome of it. And I want to stress, and I say this to business people, but I want to stress as people who work in hierarchical organizations, the church is hierarchical and education is hierarchical, we have to be very sensitive to our roles and what that looks like to others. We have titles that are important, and we have titles that are impressive. We have credentials, and we're educated and esteemed, but we can't let that get in the way of our humility. Our And that's why I begin with saying the posture of all leadership is first humility. That's why we started with it. We're about to kind of wind down, but we'll touch on it in different ways. I always facilitate a day that if something theoretically, hypothetically happened and we just had to shut down right now, you've got the most important part already, because it is about humility. It is about humility.